Okay, so we've just come to 12 noon in Japan time and 1 p.m. Australia time. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Leading from the Living Room, brought to you by the Dream Collective. What we do here in these webinars, if we have live, unfiltered conversations with global executives, today we're very excited to have Vijay from N-World with us today to delve deep into key insights for Japan's job market. So before we jump right in, for anybody who may be new to the Dream Collective community, we are a global diversity and inclusion consultancy. Our mission is to work with businesses to help them attract, retain, or advance their female talent. So we do that through consulting, training, and branding projects. And speaking on in Japan, we've just launched a book in March called Together She Shines Brighter, bringing together 20 leading businesses sharing their leaders' stories. Yes. So for today, I'll be your moderator. I'm Natsumi. I'm leading the Japan business for the Dream Collective. My passion really comes from driving that change in female advancement for Japan, from commitment and hope, but also from frustration. I think there's so much more that we can do, and really excited to be part of that change and here today. So today we have Vijay Deol from N-World today. He's a president and representative director. He has a lot of experience in the talent recruitment industry and here to share with us some of N-World's key insights that they've gathered throughout this period. And then also we'll delve into discussion about the job market in Japan. So thank you for joining us today, Vijay.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm excited to participate in this. It's my first time to be a panelist in a virtual web-based event. I've done them in person before. I'm not sure which one is more nervous, but thank you for having me. I'm actually not in my living room, I'm in my bedroom, so hopefully that's all right. But yeah, I'm happy to start getting into some discussion around the job market and the labor market in this COVID situation and COVID world that we live in now.
Thank you so much, Vijay. And yes, living room, bedroom, everything is fine. So wonderful to have you here today. So today we have 1 hour together in this webinar. We'll start actually with Vijay kicking off and sharing some of N-World's key findings from their recent survey research, then go into discussion surrounding the key points, and we'll be taking in questions from the audience as well. So everybody who's joined us today, and actually we have a very global audience, people joining in from Australia, Japan, UK, US, Singapore. So really excited to see what kind of questions come up. As Vijay is presenting as well, I encourage everyone to submit their questions throughout the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. And Vijay, without further ado, I'll pass it on to you.
Okay, thank you. Let me see if I can get my screen sharing here. Okay, is that working? Can you see that?
All good.
All right, so yeah, I'll just start with a very quick summary, just a few slides on the job market in Japan and the labor market. And this is based on a bit of macro data that we have, as well as a couple of surveys that we've done with our clients and our candidates. Can I move through this slide here? Okay. So just before we get into that, I do want to quickly introduce N-World for those of you who aren't so familiar with our firm. So N-World, I would say we're the leading firm in Japan focusing on global talent. Our headquarters is in Japan. We do operate throughout the region. We have offices in India, Thailand, and Vietnam. We are primarily a recruitment services firm. We also have a recruitment process outsourcing division. We cover both permanent and contract-based recruitment. And global talent, meaning companies in Japan that are global, that need talent, whether it's foreign companies that need English-speaking staff here, or Japanese companies who have global businesses and need people who can operate in a global environment. Those are the types of areas that we focus on. Our mission is enabling success. What we want to do is make people successful. We're not focused simply on helping people change jobs, but helping people, once they've changed jobs, to have long-term successful and fulfilling careers, and for the companies that hire them to be more successful because of that. All right, so that's N-World. Let me get into our data here. So first of all, this is just a little bit of macro data for the job market in Japan. So probably most people are aware Japan has always been a very, or at least for the last many years, has always been a very talent short market. The job to applicant ratio, so the number of open positions compared to the number of people available to fill those positions, has been very heavily favoring the applicants. So there's more jobs available than applicants to fill them. I think the ratio was at about close to 1.6 in 2019. As you can see from this graph, it's dropped off quite considerably. So COVID has obviously had quite a serious effect in Japan, as it has across the world. But I think one of the encouraging things for Japan is that there still is enough positions that exceed the number of applicants. So the job market is still healthy here, despite the impact suffered via COVID. It just demonstrates, I think, the extreme demographics in Japan and the extreme labor shortage here. So that's something that is going to persist, while COVID is part of our lives and post-COVID as well. The next slide, it says micro perspective. So this data is actually just based on our firm's job requisitions from our clients. So this is a little bit skewed. It doesn't reflect the entire market. The market would be more severe than this in terms of what's actually been experienced in terms of declining demand for hiring. But yeah, as you can see, there was a significant drop off in March, particularly for contract positions. I think we saw a lot of companies' knee-jerk reaction was to simply terminate contractors or stop contract hiring, anticipating a serious economic downturn. That continued in April. But I think as you can see in May and June, things are starting to warm up, and I think people are starting to realize that this is the world we live in now. Life isn't going to stop, so business has to go on, and there's still a need for resources and human resources. And as I said in the first slide, the talent market is still short in Japan. One other thing, and I think I'll comment on this in the next slide as well, is that we did see probably a more drastic reaction from foreign companies than from Japanese companies. So initially we saw about 40% of our foreign clients go on an immediate hiring freeze. And that was a larger percentage than we saw from Japanese companies. Again, that's starting to warm up, I think, and hopefully that trend continues. But it was a pretty severe reaction in the first part of this year, and particularly the Japanese fiscal year from April onwards. This is a trend by industry in terms of job openings. So again, as you can see, there's most industries suffering a negative impact from COVID. Healthcare and life sciences, as you might expect, relatively resilient. But across the board, there's been an impact, and those companies that have had more exposure to a business model, more exposed to COVID, have been more severely affected. What we did see was, for example, I think this is actually not reflective of the overall market, but consumer goods initially having a really severe impact with stores being closed and things like that. But actually that being balanced by companies capitalizing on e-commerce sales. What we also saw were firms that maybe fall into consumer, or for example, IT and telecommunications, big firms that you guys might know of that are focused on delivering things to people through online platforms, really doing well and hiring aggressively because of that, because there's maybe less competition in the market right now. So, they can snap up good talent with less competition. This next slide, we have, it's titled Measures for Avoiding Infection. Now, that's not kind of comprehensive in terms of what people are doing or what companies are doing to social distance or to disinfect their offices or things like that. This is more about companies' recruiting practices. And what we see is that companies are still actively recruiting. Obviously, there's been an impact and there's a slowdown in recruitment activities, at least initially. But one interesting thing that we have seen is that those companies that are continuing to hire are much more likely to use video interviews. And this is something, pre-COVID, we really almost never saw companies willing to make a hiring decision based on a video interview. So that's an interesting development, and it's something that I think will, more flexible recruitment market in the long term. So it's quite interesting. The other thing, and I think this is the last slide that I'll go through before we get into the Q&A, is people's attitudes towards changing jobs. This is something that I also found quite interesting because people still are open to changing jobs. And I think COVID, what it's done is there are people who have become more nervous about their job security and are therefore have been more proactive. So people who, I think 70% of people said they changed their attitude towards future career and job change. Those were people who already were looking for jobs or open to new career opportunities, have become more aggressive or more open, and people who weren't have started. So we've seen a lot of people affected by the COVID situation, and I think it's based on a lot of uncertainty around job security, but also a lot of desire to work in an environment that's going to be more accommodating to this type of economic environment that we're in. So I'm sure we'll get into some of that in the Q&A as well. So I hope that's a quick enough summary and kind of highlights the key points from the surveys that we had done. Maybe I'll stop there and back over to Natsumi.
Thank you, Vijay, and thank you for sharing those insights in the graphs, really insightful. And I think one thing that I particularly find surprising is that, there's actually so many people out there who are still really actively, and you said aggressively, looking to change jobs during this period. So Vijay, I'm actually really curious to see if there's anything that you found personally surprising or unexpected from this survey research.
Yeah, I think the two things that I mentioned to you previously that I thought were quite surprising. One is that the job market in Japan was so resilient that the talent shortage is so extreme that even in this situation, which is probably the worst economic downturn that we've seen in our lives, even probably worse than the Lehman situation, it's still a 1.25 job to applicant ratio. So there's still, despite the decline in hiring, still not enough people to fill the job. So I thought that was one thing that was quite surprising to me. The other thing is in the candidates' attitudes, the job seekers' attitudes. So I was working in recruitment in 2008 when the Lehman shock happened. For those of you who are from other countries, that's the 2008 financial crisis, I think we call it in the West. But the Lehman shock, as we call it in Japan, we did see, at least for, I think, initial period after September, October 2008, that candidates were quite hesitant to change jobs. So we saw, I think we would have had, if we'd done this survey at that time, it would have been the opposite or a slightly different kind of response. But I think now it seems that people are more open-minded about changing jobs and maybe more proactive to respond to a situation that's negative and want to take their future into their own hands rather than feel secure in hanging on to a position that they might have.
And I think when you touched upon, comparing it with that financial crisis in 2008, it's so different. And the fact that COVID-19, nobody expected this. Is a very unprecedented time and still continues. And I think the shift before was, okay, what will we do when it's finished? But now it's really living with it. How do we cope with it, continuing on in our lives for the next couple of years? So it's really interesting to see that difference in that. So Vijay, I've actually, I've got a couple of questions prepared for you today, but also everybody in the audience, we'll be picking up live questions through the Q&A box as well. So everybody who's tuning in, make sure you submit them and we'll make sure that we address them throughout as well. So firstly, I think, a core message throughout some of the data that you presented was the shifts in attitudes, in the numbers. And with a lot of these changes happening in terms of career pivots and directions of what people are looking for, what do you think the key implications are for businesses actually for retaining and attracting talent?
I think it's probably no surprise or no secret that the COVID situation has really driven, a trend towards flexible working arrangements. So, for companies who want to attract and retain the best talent, they're going to have an environment where people can work from home, where people can have flexible working hours and take care of their families. And some companies were doing, a really good job of this before the COVID situation. Japan was probably lagging behind a lot of the Western world in that respect. And this situation is really going to force Japan to catch up, and it's going to really separate those companies that are able to, create a good working environment, a good flexible working environment, good flexible working policies from those who aren't. And the ones who do will win the best talent. I'm pretty sure of that. The other thing I think it's highlighted is employees focus on health and safety and well-being. So, I think during the COVID crisis and the peaks of the infection rates, people are worried about their own health and they're worried about whether they have to go to the office. If they do have to go to the office, is it being disinfected properly? Is there proper social distancing? And that's going to continue, I think, for the duration of this until there's a vaccine or until we're in a post-COVID world. But I do think even in a post-COVID world, people are going to be more aware of companies' understanding of their employees' health and well-being, and that extends, I think, to their families as well. Because right now people don't want to go home if they have especially in Japan, a parent or a grandparent to take care of and put them at risk. And their company's understanding and accommodation of that is going to be really important for talent attraction and retention.
Definitely. And I think when I was reading through your research data, you mentioned that, the top priority now for people who are looking to change their careers is now the ability to work, to be able to work remotely, which was something that never seemed to be a priority for people who are looking for jobs in Japan. So kind of going back there, why do you think that was the reason, and why was remote work not seen as a priority pre-COVID?
Yeah, I mean, I am sensitive. I'm not Japanese, so I'm going to be commenting on my perception of Japanese culture and things that exist in Japanese business practice. But I've been living here for nearly 20 years and working in recruitment here for over 15. So hopefully I have some relevant insight. I think in Japan and Japanese business culture, it is important to the tatemae, or the outward kind of appearance that people portray in their work persona is really important, right? And so showing up to the office, demonstrating in front of everybody that you're working hard is really important. And that was something that I think held back people moving to more flexible working environments and, being working from home where it's not as visible. The other thing is, trust and personal communication and relationships are so important in Japan. And that's harder to establish and harder to maintain when you're not physically together. So I think that's another reason that Japan's been slow to change. And I think, there's also a lot of positives that come from being in an office together. There's a sense of community, a sense of teamwork that I think is harder to achieve if everybody's watching each other through video screens or working in their own home. So I think that, there's cultural reasons that go very, very deep that were why maybe Japan has been slow to change. And I think, Japan is also a country that is relatively conservative when it comes to change in general. So, moving to a very, very different working environment would be, very uncertain in terms of achieving all of the positive things about Japanese business culture that happen by being in the office and being a team and working hard together. I think are some of the reasons that it's held Japan back in moving towards more flexible working arrangements in general. But I definitely think COVID is forcing corporate Japan to catch up.
Yes, and I think a lot of us are really excited for the progression that's happening right now, and with moving from more of a paperless society. I know that there was some news that international people were shocked at when they saw that Japanese people were going into their offices to stamp documents. And I had some friends reach out to say, "Is that really true? Do people have to do that?" But
Yeah.
we're seeing that progress, and in government as well, they're looking to go completely paperless in the near future. So that's really exciting.
Yeah.
We've actually just gotten our first Q&A question from the audience. So someone has asked, which sector are you seeing the biggest hiring demand?
Biggest hiring demand. I would say in some subsectors of life sciences, we're seeing big hiring demand. So those are any companies that are developing treatments or drugs or products that are related to treatment of COVID or prevention of COVID. Definitely lots of hiring going on there. I think the other key area that we're seeing a lot of hiring is any technology or tech-based companies that focus on flexible working. So Zoom, for example, or are catering to people being at home more. So obviously companies, that like Amazons and Rakutens, those are the types of companies that probably are going to benefit from this, and anyone in those types of spaces are going to be, hiring aggressively, I think.
Definitely. Thank you for that. And I think, going through what are the hiring processes and what's happening in Japan, a lot of people, especially now that we have an international audience, have actually looked at Japan and said, actually, Japan's maintained a relatively low unemployment rate throughout this crisis. So it's currently sitting at around 2.6%, I believe. Yet it seems as though public sentiment on Japan's future seems to remain quite pessimistic throughout the media and also through conversations as well. So
I'm sorry, Natsumi. It just cut out for me for a second there. Could you
yeah,
repeat
yes. Can you hear me now?
the question, please?
Can you hear me now, Vijay? Can you hear me, Vijay? Hello? Can you hear me?
Okay, sorry. It seems to be back now. Yeah,
That's
it was
right.
froze up there for a second. Apologies for that.
No worries. Maybe it was my internet as well. What I was touching on was, the fact that Japan's maintaining a low unemployment rate throughout this crisis, but even so, public sentiment on the future and the outlook seems to still be quite pessimistic. So why do you think that this could be the case?
Yeah, I think Japan has kind of gotten a bad rap for a long time in terms of its economic opportunity, and a lot of it comes down to slow or non-existent GDP growth. For probably 30 or more years. But I think that's people see this kind of macro news about Japan's GDP and Japan having been past its prime when it was booming in the 60s and 70s and maybe early 80s. But I think it's not really accurate to take that view, because Japan has had really actually good performance in terms of GDP per capita relative to other G7 countries, for example. A lot of that is, of course, driven by the declining population. But Japan's still a wealthy country. The middle class here is relatively large and relatively wealthy. So companies want to do business in Japan. We work with mostly foreign companies, and not a lot of them, I would say all of them, want to have a successful business in Japan, because there's still a big market opportunity, even if it's not growing dramatically. Those companies that are not here and don't have a foothold here yet, it's a huge market that is untapped for them. So I think it's a bit of skewed perception because of the media and the macro economic situation, and countries like China or India may be growing faster, that Japan gets this pessimistic picture of it painted, and that I think is amplified when you have a situation like COVID. The other thing I think is that, like I said before, I think Japanese people and Japanese culture is quite conservative in general. So I think they would tend not to be super optimistic when you have a super negative influence from an external macroeconomic factor, right? So I think there tends to be a more conservative, and that leads to becoming a more pessimistic view taken in general.
Yeah. That's definitely some of the key points that why it could lead to that. And I think, I want to lead it on to a question that we've gotten from Ning in the audience. Going from that Japan level to, I'm talking about N-World and how, N-World was impacted by the current situation. So Ning is saying that as a recruitment company, I'm guessing that N-World has been impacted by the drop of position numbers. So how have you been managing the cost to survive? And are there many other recruiting companies that are letting people go or cutting salary? And is there any action that you've been taking for this and making sure that the communication goes well internally?
Yeah, I guess I probably can't go into specific financial details, but obviously we've been affected. Our sales year on year are down compared to 2019, but I think we reacted very quickly. So first of all, any kind of non-essential expenses, business travel, company parties, those types of things, we've cut out of the budget for this year. Our senior management did take a pay cut that is in effect for a certain period of time until mid this year, potentially longer, depending on how things develop. And we did make use of a government subsidy program to put a certain number of people on paid leave of absence. So they're still employed by us, but they're not working, and the government will subsidize part of that. Those would be the major actions that we've taken, and I think it's allowed us to stay profitable, and we've been robust so far. So if the situation continues to improve, as I think we've seen in the data I showed from May to June, then I think we can relax some of those measures going forward. But yeah, I think we've been able to stay above break-even levels. We've not had to cut staff salaries across the board. We've not had to cut personnel. So I think I'm pretty pleased at how we've done that and prioritized people's employment and people's livelihoods throughout so far.
That's really good to know. And I think, comparing to what is happening and how you're managing, it's definitely a difficult time for any business in any industry. But kind of going back to one of the comments that you made earlier on comparing the COVID-19 crisis to the financial crisis, I think one of the key differentiations that has been in discussion as well is the fact that COVID-19 has actually hit women harder on a global scale because of the industries that have been hit and because of the frontline workers in those industries being majority female. This is on a global scale, and I'd love to know what your thoughts are on the effect in Japan for females throughout this crisis.
Yeah, we had a bit of an exchange about this beforehand, and I looked into some data. So I'm sure that this is much more dramatic in other countries, but Japan's been quite resilient in terms of its unemployment. It went from 2.4% in 2019 to 2.6% now, depending on which reports you read. That amounts to about 160,000 people, I think. And I've read news where they've claimed that over 700,000 non-regular female employees have become unemployed in Japan. So, whether it's somewhere between 100 and 700,000 women affected by this in Japan, because they're non-regular employees, I think that it is true that they're feeling that more than the male workforce, because they do make up more of a percentage of the non-regular workforce or the contract workforce. But I think this is not a COVID issue. This is an issue that is going back a long time and is very deep-seated in Japan and in many other countries, is simply the fact that higher value permanent positions are predominantly occupied by men. And although there's been an initiative in Japan with Abenomics and Womenomics to get more women in the workforce, and on the surface it appears to be working, a lot of it is because women are taking these non-traditional, non-permanent and contract type of work arrangements. So I think, COVID or no COVID, the root cause of that is not more women being in the high value type of corporate positions in Japan.
Yes, I think you've touched on you've hit the nail on the head there in terms of what the Japanese government is and what the cultural context of Japan is. And I'm sure that many of you in the audience as well have read the news that the Japanese government had that 30% female leadership target for 2020. They've actually now pushed that back to be hit by 2030. So it's really, you can see the slow progress there and the fact that there's just simply not enough female leaders in Japan still. And I think, not just a COVID issue, but it's still continuing on, and it's almost been amplified by the fact that, these changes have happened and these have been the impacts on women. I'm wondering for you, Vijay, what do you think the key players that can support these people? So say the government, employers, and recruitment firms like Enworld, what do you think you can do to support these women in vulnerable positions?
I think, I don't think there's any kind of quick action. I don't think the government can say, well, we're going to give another 100,000 yen to one very, specific selection of the population. That's probably not practical. And like I said, I think, the unemployment rate is still very low. So I think if anything needs to be done by the government or by corporate Japan or recruitment companies, it is addressing the root causes of why there's not more women in the workforce or proportionally represented in all parts of the workforce. But again, I think it goes down to, government policy. It goes down to also, just general attitudes and very, again, deep cultural behaviors in Japan, both from women and from men, where, even women, I was in an event held by the French Chamber of Commerce a few weeks ago, and there was a Tokyo University professor who was sharing his research on attitudes of men and women in Japan. And actually women are more satisfied and more happy with their lives in Japan than men are. And this is, his, I guess, proposition was that the average salaryman's lifestyle is maybe not particularly attractive to women to get into that type of career lifestyle. So I think there needs to be a lot of changes, like from the overall structure of Japanese corporate lifestyle, where men can also have more flexible lifestyles, where the demands of that as a salaryman are different on their time. And I do think this COVID situation with more flexible working arrangements, and companies like Fujitsu announcing that they're going to allow flexible working arrangements long term, will change the way corporate Japan uses its human resources. And you could see a salaryman having more of a lifestyle where he can spend time with his family as well as work. And women then will see that as an attractive opportunity to pursue. So I think it needs to be from in all parts of the population to understand that there's different ways of doing things. And in 2020 and COVID world and post-COVID world, those are going to be more necessary. So I think going forward, that's what has to happen across all levels of the country. For corporate Japan, I do think there is an opportunity, even pre-COVID now and going forward, to really capitalize though on high potential female talent, which I don't think happens. There's definitely a tendency to encourage women to pursue careers, especially if they have families. And I think that's just wrong. We've had lots of really talented women work in N-World, and I've seen lots of really talented women work in corporate Japan. And the companies that don't capitalize on that, they're really making a bad mistake. And the ones that do, I think, can really set an example and set a trend to be the leaders in enabling that.
And I think, that's all we talk about at the Dream Collective as well, is that diversity, inclusion, female representation isn't just a nice to have, and we have to do it for the sake of, just, hitting those numbers. It's really a strategic imperative. It's something that really pushes the businesses forwards to innovation, to that progress and hitting your targets and everything. So that's really interesting to see. And going back a little bit to the research and the numbers that you showed, there was a bit of discussion on some of the trends on what skills job seekers are improving on. So some of them being like, upskilling themselves, learning English, especially in Japan, things like that. But do these trends, do you think they reflect on what employers are looking for in this climate as well?
Yeah, I did. I was asking some of our senior sales managers in preparation for this event how they felt about that, because they were the ones talking to clients on a day-to-day basis. And I think there is an overlap in what companies are looking for and what job seekers are trying to proactively improve in their own skill sets. So you see things like, I think came high up in our survey, were things like programming and coding and data analysis. And these are things that have always been important, but I think are becoming more important because of the COVID situation, and companies that do well in that are thriving. So I think there's an overlap there in terms of what people are trying to do to better themselves and what companies are looking for. The other things that came up high in the survey, I think, were English language study. In Japan, that's always been a really, really hard thing to improve. And there's always, while there's a talent shortage in general, bilingual talent shortage is orders of magnitude bigger than that. So that will continue to be in high demand, and companies definitely still value that because things are getting more global all the time. And not only just English language skills, but communication skills and ability to manage change, ability to communicate when in times of uncertainty. These types of things are becoming more and more important as well. So we saw some of the skill sets that people were focusing on, or not maybe specific skill sets, but types of courses like MBA courses or psychology or coaching type of courses. Again, I think really relate to that. So I do think there's an overlap and there's an understanding between job seekers and what hiring managers and companies are looking for.
And I think on the topic of language, we've gotten a question from the audience asking how important is the knowledge of the Japanese language for jobs in Japan? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, obviously it's Japan, so it's extremely important. I think though, when I think about my own career in recruitment, 15 years ago, if I got a CV come across my desk from a foreigner, I probably wouldn't look at it. I wouldn't consider it for any position that I was working on. But that's not the case anymore. Especially, I think, COVID will impact this, but pre-COVID, say 2019, we were seeing far more non-Japanese being able to come to work in Japan, even if their Japanese language skills weren't very strong, depending on the company they worked in and depending on the skill set they had. So, for example, certain technology sectors or IT system integrators, for example, would bring over a lot of people from China, from India, people with really high level technical skills, but not necessarily high level language skills. And they would organize their company or their business model so that those people could do their jobs without necessarily needing to speak or read Japanese. But still, of the percentage of candidates that we place, I would say, and I'm guessing here off the top of my head, but probably around 90% still are Japanese. And of those 10% that aren't Japanese, they would have varying levels of Japanese fluency. So while it's not, a majority yet of people who can work in Japan without Japanese language skills still very much, the norm, that it's absolutely necessary. It has been changing gradually over the last several years.
Yes, and I think we've gotten another question kind of on that from the audience, from Ivy. You mentioned a bit about the diversity of the work culture currently in Japan in terms of the racial percentage, but I'm also wondering, how can Japanese businesses attract more foreign talents?
Well, I mean, if they can accommodate non-Japanese speakers, that's one thing, right? So if they have English-speaking Japanese there, that will be part of it. But I do think there's a bit of a apprehension amongst foreigners to work in a very domestic Japanese business culture, because it can be seen as very rigid. It can be seen as very exclusive, excluding foreigners, and difficult to operate in. So I think those companies that can become more flexible, have more flexible working arrangements, and that doesn't just mean allowing people to work from home, but also, in terms of how people do their jobs and their mobility within the company. Can they get promoted based on merit? Can their salaries increase based on their performance rather than their age? Those types of things I think are the things that foreigners will be more open to if they're considering a Japanese company, if a Japanese company has those types of systems.
And I think in Japan, there's still, a long way to go in terms of really diversifying their international talents, but there's definitely, one step at a time. And, going through kind of what the key shifts are within, the current climate. You mentioned that obviously being able to work remotely, and now going through interviews and everything, doing them virtually. Even this webinar is the norm now, and it's kind of the new normal. But so Yvonne is asking that, what does it actually mean to be able to work remotely, and what are the implicit skills that people need and employers are looking for in terms of effective remote work?
Well, I think, working remotely means not having to be in a company's office. I think, there's going to be some jobs that require people to be on site and can't do their job from home. Somebody working on a factory, operating some type of machinery, they obviously oftentimes can't do that at home. But for most white collar types of positions in Tokyo or in corporate Japan, you don't necessarily need to physically be in an office. Obviously, it's nice to be able to sit across from somebody when you have a meeting with them and talk to them in person, but it's 2020. We're doing this online, and you can do that now. So, I think having a flexible working arrangement or being able to work remotely means being able to do things like this, and having a tech infrastructure and IT infrastructure where people can do their jobs from home or from a cafe, whatever the job may be. That's what needs to be in place. And I think, there's definitely technologies to facilitate that now. As long as companies can implement those and take advantage of them, that allows remote working. I think, in terms of what employers want from employees to be able to work effectively in that type of style, well, obviously they need maturity. They need to be able to have independence and self-motivation. And they need to also have, I think, a savviness in their communication ability, because it is harder to communicate on a Zoom meeting or a Teams meeting than it is in person. And you also need to be smart about, how you're using your time, when you need to send an email and when you need to book a meeting. and when you need to maybe demand that things happen in person. So I think those are the types of mindsets that probably are going to be more important and that companies are going to value more.
Thank you for that, Vijay. And then we're actually getting a lot of questions from the audience.
Okay.
Some really actually focused on N-World. A lot of people want to know about what's going on in your company. So one from the audience is asking, how is N-World, supporting the engagement of your employees working remotely? And also one question from me is, what are the changes and innovations that you've made to adapt and thrive in this new environment?
I think, recruitment is a business where, I've often said anybody with a Excel sheet and a mobile phone can do the job. You don't necessarily need to be in a physical office. Obviously, if you have a large company like N-World that has an infrastructure and has a budget for marketing and, can support candidate acquisition and has a large client portfolio, those things all make it a lot easier to be successful as a recruiter. But actually physically sitting at a desk with your team, I don't think has ever been a mandatory requirement of being successful in recruitment. And, also sitting, in a meeting room or in a cafe with a candidate or in a client's office has also never been an absolutely mandatory requirement. You can have those conversations on the phone. You always could. And now we're just having them via video conference, rather than on the phone. Of course, there is benefit. And, I think when COVID, we have a vaccine or whatever happens, that people don't have to worry so much about infection, I think we will go back to having more face-to-face interaction, but it'll be in a more flexible type of arrangement. So N-World, we've implemented Microsoft Teams. That's been really useful for us, and we've given everybody, at least all of our sales force, I think so far, laptops and mobile phones. So they should be 100% able to access whatever information they need and to communicate with whoever they need to communicate with from wherever they are. I think that's probably the biggest one that we've done. We've also implemented DocuSign, so we don't need to physically sign or Hunko, contracts or things like that anymore. So, making things virtual or digital as much as possible so people can do their jobs. But I think that's one part of it, that hardware or that resource that people have, we've tried to accommodate. The other part of it is, how do we engage with our employees? So, how does a manager talk to his team? And I think what we've encouraged most of our team managers to do is to at least have, a morning and an afternoon catch up with all of their staff members so that they know what's going on, they can set a plan for the day, and they can feel engaged. And that's on a team by team and a more day-to-day kind of tactical level. From a senior management level, we've made sure that we've not stopped any kind of our normal company-wide communication. So we're going to have an annual kickoff meeting in April that was meant to be at, I think, the Prince Hotel in a big banquet room. We shifted that to an online annual kickoff. We've had monthly company-wide meetings as we have previously in person. We've done that online, and we've actually increased the amount of communication. So now we do a weekly update from myself to the entire business. Anybody can tune in to Teams and hear what is going on in the company and make sure that they're up to date on, how our business results are going, if there's any, further austerity measures, or if we're going to relax our austerity measures. Here's some success stories from people who've, been able to be really successful despite the environment. So a lot of these different types of efforts, and I think, actually making bigger efforts to engage and communicate because we're not all in the same room has been really, really important.
And it seems like, N-World has had the infrastructure there, but even more so with this environment, you've stepped up and had those, lots of communication steps in place. And that's really the key, I think, when we're in a remote workspace, to have that communication, turning your camera on, having those daily stand-ups with your team. It really does make a big difference. And that's something that Japan as a whole didn't accept as much before. And, as we've said continuously throughout this webinar, Japan's always struggled with, implementing change, but also making quick changes and speeding up that change as well. And COVID-19 has kind of really forced us to have to make a change. It's not a choice anymore. So, I think it's a great opportunity in a sense for that. And what else do you think we can do as individuals, but also as companies, to really make the most of this and accelerate and elevate this change?
Yeah, I think, well, one thing about, my opinion of Japan is that Japan is actually really good at executing change once the decision has been made. It takes a long time to get that decision made, but once everybody's on board with it, they will execute better than any other, culture that I know of. So I think Japan being forced to change more quickly because of COVID, there will be some real positives that come out of it. And I think Japan, we could see Japan come out as a leader when it comes to flexible working arrangements and things like that, because they're forced to accept it now. Now they're going to do the best possible job they can with it. So I do think there's a big opportunity there. So from a corporate perspective, those companies that just realize this is what the world is like now, there's no going back. So do the best possible job you can do with it. Those are the ones that are going to be most successful for sure. On an individual basis, I really think it's people should understand there needs to be a level of maturity. I think, and I'm pleased to say that I believe N-World, at least our employees, have reacted in a mature way. I think we've got a lot of positive feedback. We've got a lot of good questions come up, good ideas come up. But people need to understand that in this type of environment, and again, it's not going to really go away. They need to be more responsible for their own success and their own activities, their own performance. If your manager's not sitting next to you, breathing down your neck or looking over your shoulder, you still need to get your work done. And as the more people can understand that and accept that and take a mature approach to it, the better.
Yeah, and on that topic of what N-World's doing, we've gotten another question about N-World and what you're doing. So much interest from the audience. An attendee is saying that, what is N-World doing to enhance its female leadership in terms of fast-tracking leadership programs, training programs, and such?
Yeah, it's really a difficult problem to solve. When I came back to N-World in 2017, we had that time maybe 30, 35 sales managers, only 2 of which I think were female. And now I think we have 4. I hope I'm not mistaken about that number. So, we've doubled it, but it's not like we've now have 50% female leadership in our sales organization. So it's hard. It's a hard thing to improve. I think it's a long-term challenge to meet. So I don't think anybody, if they expect to if they have 100% male leadership right now, to go to 50% next year is unrealistic. So I think first of all, we just need to take a realistic approach, understand that it's going to take a long time, and it's going to also mean not just promoting women for the sake of promoting women, but really understanding our hiring practices, making sure that we're not, we don't have unconscious biases in terms of who we hire, and that we make sure we hire the best people. If we are genuinely hiring the best people, probably we're going to get about half and half, men and women, as new hires. And then once we look at our junior staff and our high potential young staff, how do we enable them? How do we develop them? And make sure that we don't have barriers for the women and enable the men. We need to make sure that we're enabling everybody in the same way. And again, the most talented, the highest performing people, should rise to the top. And then you would naturally see, an even distribution, I think. So that's kind of the big picture way that I'm looking at it. In terms of actual specific actions we've taken, well, we did have an engagement with the Dream Collective, and we went through a project with you guys over about 18 months, I think, ending last year, which was really helpful. So I'll make a pitch for the Dream Collective right now that they did a good job with us. And what the outcomes of that were, I think we categorized a number of different areas where we could improve. And these came around how we promote people, how we train people, our flexible working environment, and I think our compensation. So there was a few different categories that we saw, things we could take specific action on. And some of them we've already taken action on. Some of them we've, our HR department or some of our other departments have already made progress on. And some of them we're still not sure how we can execute. So we've created what's called our ambassador group. And this is a group of about, I think, 20 people in junior to senior staff level, not management. I think pretty evenly a mix of men and women, to be kind of the voice for the entire organization and the channel through which we can communicate better with senior management. So we really understand what's the junior members' challenges and expectations, and how we can enable them. And that's not just for our female staff, but for all of our staff. So I would say hopefully in the long term that allows us to have a more equal opportunity organization, and gradually we'll see a better mix of gender and nationality and, whatever other category in our management team.
And, thank you for giving a shout out to the Dream Collective's consulting. We really enjoyed working with you and seeing that progress within the NWorld organization. One thing I think in the diversity and inclusion conversation, and, a new word that's been popped in right now as well, is equity. So really, as you mentioned, understanding those barriers and understanding that not everybody is at the same stage. Some people might have, 2 steps in front of them already just because of their background, their gender, many other factors. So really keeping that in mind, taking that into account and making decisions around hiring, evaluation and all of that. We've gotten actually a question for you, another question for you, Vijay, about talking about female advancement and how you're making those initiatives and steps in NWorld. What advice would you give to someone, perhaps to a female colleague or candidate that's going into a leadership position for the very first time?
Advice to a female who's going into leadership for the very first time?
Very first time.
I think, I don't know if I've ever thought about that question in the context of specifically for a female, because I've never been in that position myself, obviously. But I do think about people, anybody, whether they're men or women, going into leadership position for the first time. And I think I would probably give them similar advice. Some of the things that I would say would be, first of all, you have to own, your own performance, your own ambitions. Don't wait for somebody to tell you what to do or to give you the next step. You need to be vocal about it. You need to raise your hand and you need to ask for what you want. So you need to be proactive and you need to take ownership of your own destiny, I guess. The other thing I think when it comes to leadership is people need to think about all layers of the organization, all directions. So they need to think about how they're working with their senior management, and if those senior management need to endorse them and sponsor them to have a more successful career and to take bigger steps in their career. But they also need to understand that the people they're managing need to be bought into them and they need to be engaged with them, and that's really important as well. And if that's not happening, then they're not going to get anywhere in their career either. So taking a holistic view of how their relationships work within an organization and how their performance is viewed, how the expectations of their staff or of their senior management work. Those are things that they need to be constantly aware of. And then they need to be, they need to be fair. They need to set an example. They need to lead from the front. They need to be able to perform. And I think anybody who does those things will naturally come out as a leader and have people follow them and have people respect them.
Yes, and I think it's coming from the fact that in Japan a lot of the time, and this is an assumption I'm making for the question, but why it's saying why the question was on a female candidate going into a leadership position for the first time. I think a lot of companies tend to say that females don't put their hands up for management roles, and that's not necessarily because they're not motivated. It's because they're not really sure where to go. The lack of role models, I think, is one big thing that we need to change in Japan, and we need to, as you said as well, have that environment to support people and for people, other women to lead those emerging female talent as well. So that's really good.
One thing maybe just on that, I guess you did point out that having role models is important. Yeah. And I think, it's a tough situation for a new female leader if they're in an organization where there's not people within the organization who are female, who are leaders, who have more experience that they can look to as a mentor. So maybe one other bit of advice for female leaders who are in that type of situation is look outside your organization. Look to your customers, look to your vendors, look to, firms like the Dream Collective, because there are female leaders out there. They just might not be working at your company. But I do think, there's a lot of openness and a lot of willingness to support people who want to, better themselves and better their careers, whether they work for you or with you or not.
And I think, you did kind of touch upon it, but we just got a new question from the audience, Yukiko, really focusing on not just female leaders, but for leaders in this new generation coming up, the emerging leaders. What do you think the key qualities that these leaders need to have or learn to really thrive in the new environment?
Well, I hope I'm right about this, but time will tell. I think, right now what I'm really feeling is that empathy is really important. Being able and also having empathy and allowing yourself to be vulnerable. So, you know, I do think people still want leaders who are strong, street leaders who are decisive and, you know, can take a clear, you know, action and clear vision of where they want to take an organization. But I think it's more than that. People don't just want someone to stand up and give really, you know, loud speeches. They want people who can understand, you know, what's going on, you know, with a staff level person in the organization and can sympathize with them and can, you know, take the time and be open-minded about understanding what their challenges are and what their difficulties are, and then getting that engagement that all levels of the organization can feel confident that leadership has their best interests in mind and wants them to be successful as well. I think that's really important, and I think that's maybe not something that I often would hear in, you know, leadership books or in traditional kind of leadership courses and things like that.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Vijay. And there's actually a lot of questions still, and I might share this with you later after the webinar because we only have a few minutes left. I want to finish with this last question on, so, you know, you've shared the insights about the data, about the changing sentiment around job pivots and career changes. So what advice would you give to those looking for a career change right now?
Okay. You know, career changes, first of all, I think it's always about timing, whether it's COVID world or not. The right job might come up tomorrow and it might not come up for, you know, another 12 months. So I think, you know, just being conscious of what the market is like, being proactive, forming the right relationships, whether it be with mentors in your organization or in other organizations that you have an acquaintance with, whether it be with the right recruiters that you trust, but making sure that you're aware of what's going on in the market and what opportunities there are and when they come up, and then being proactive about it, because it might come up when it's a COVID situation, and it might come up when, you know, the market's booming and everything's really happy and relaxed, but you have no idea when that's going to happen. So I would say just be proactive and be aware and you know, take control and take ownership of your career.
Thanks, Vijay. That's a great way to wrap up, you know, the insights into webinar. And I'm really confident that everybody tuning in today is walking away from learnings from this session. Before we just wrap up, I'd quickly like to share my screen again. So on the topic of looking for jobs, and as we touched on in the webinar, COVID-19 has really seen a tremendous impact on job losses globally, and especially for women. So what we've done at the Dream Collective, and we've partnered with N-World on this as well as a career partner. So we've built a free online capability building program for those who have been impacted by COVID-19 to really help them reskill, upskill, and be ready to go grab that next opportunity and put themselves out there. We've created this content online. You can access it through our website or by Googling She Pivots. So I'll leave the links here, and also N-World's social media channels here as well. What we've also done, not just with the program, but upon completion, you can actually access our career partners. So companies and organizations that have open job opportunities will be listed there, and World being one of them, and you'll be able to apply directly through there as a She Pivots alumni. So please, you know, check it out on our website, pass it on to anybody who might need this training opportunity right now. And Vijay, thank you so much for sharing your insights today. It was a great session.
Thank you, my pleasure.
Thank you so much. Okay, thank you everybody for tuning in. Thank you for your questions, and have a lovely afternoon.